Welcome to you all from far and near. Thank you for joining us here at Brit Avichai. We're happy to see you and to be seen by those who I can't see. We are going to be talking about seeing as it happens. We're going to be talking about vision and its opportunities and its limitations. Last week's Parsha ended on an unforgettable moment where Moshe disappears up the mountain at the end of that whole Parsha that had to do with law. He goes up towards God on his throne in the heights of heights, in the ultimate heights, and the people crane their necks to look after him. Umar'eh kvod Hashem ke'esh ochelet le'enei b'nei Yisrael. And the vision of the glory of God appeared like a burning fire before the eyes of the children of Israel. That is, we are seeing Moshe disappearing into the cloud at the top of the mountain through the eyes of the people at the base of the mountain. Le'enei b'nei Yisrael. We're interested in eyes and vision. And what they are seeing, actually, is Moshe disappearing into the cloud and a burning fire, a consuming fire. Now, this is not the first time we've heard about consuming fires. Right? If you remember the burning bush, right? That was a consuming fire too. Right? It was boer ve'eno ukal. Right? It burned. Now Moshe is disappearing up there where there is consuming fire and cloud. In other words, mystery, danger, the delight of being with God, and the danger that seems to surround it. And that's the people's last sight of him. And then they are left in his absence. They are left without him. And at this point, we change point of view in order to come into this week's Parsha, where we hear what God is saying to Moshe at the top of the mountain. Daber el b'nei Yisrael. He's giving Moshe instructions, very precise technical instructions, the shocking change of tone. Yeah. From consuming fires to a whole list of materials, gold, silver, copper, spices, woods, metals, all sorts of, I call this material shock. The shock suddenly of being confronted with a whole list of meaningless things, more and more things, a whole inventory of things. And it's only when we get to the 8th verse that we hear what the purpose of all those things is. Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tochem. That's the great poetic pasuk. By poetic, by now I think perhaps we're beginning to understand that poetic has something to do with having multiple potentials. You can do a lot with this pasuk. This pasuk opens itself up in all kinds of directions. They shall make for me a holy place, a sanctuary, if you want to be technical about it, and I shall dwell in their midst. With all the possible, you can already perhaps feel some of the resonances of that. In their midst means that the holy place will be in their midst, and I will dwell in it. Right. Technically, that's what it means. But if you have got an ear for other meanings, then you're already going to know that there's something about that b'tocham. I will live among them, in them. Not just in it, which is among them, but that in some way God is saying, I will live among Bnei Yisrael, in them. Not just among them, but inside them, in some sense. So there are possibilities here. And then there's all the instructions. All the instructions follow the technical instructions of what to do with all these materials. One piece of furniture after another of the Mishkan is detailed, and the instructions are given. But I'm interested, of course, in what the people see. What is Moshe seeing? What does Moshe see? We're not told specifically what, but we are told that God says to him, speak to the children of Israel. Now is a moment for speaking. And this is at the end of many visions that have happened around Har Sinai. Har Sinai, apparently many things were seen by the people and by Moshe. How do we know that many things were seen? During Matan Torah, before in Parshat Yitro, during the giving of the Torah, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the giving of the laws, certain things were seen by the people. We know because much later, 40 years later, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe will say to the people, Hishamer, you can see it in number 3 on your page. And actually number 4. Let's go straight to number 4. 4a. Rak hishamer lecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od. Right? Take heed and keep yourself very diligently. You know, whatever it means somewhere where you've got to be very, very tense and careful about this. Pen tishkach et hadvarim asher ra'u einecha. Lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen. That is, it's understood that they've seen things. They saw things where and when. Let's finish the verse now. Hadvarim asher ra'u einecha, the things that your eyes have seen. Upen yasuru milvavcha, and lest they move away from your heart, lest you forget them, lest you forget the things of your eyes. Kol yemei chayecha. You've got to hold them in your mind and your heart all the days of your life. And you shall let them know, you shall teach them to your children and to your children's children. What shall you teach? Where did you see those things? When did you see them? The day when you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. So remember, but the word is not remember. The word is not don't forget. Hold on to it. Make sure that you are not going, right, somewhere exert yourself to make sure that you don't fall prey to that human foible, which is called forgetting, pen tishkach, the things your eyes saw on that day. What did their eyes see? Especially in view of the fact that Moshe is now talking to the next generation of the children of Israel. He's not actually talking to the generation. This is 40 years later in the book of Deuteronomy. And strictly speaking, no one over 20 who was 20 at Matan Torah is still alive. Which means that by and large, it's a new generation. What have they seen? What are they supposed to remember? And that's where the Talmud comes in and extends the possibilities of seeing. Maybe it means more than we think. It's not purely visual. 4b. Anyone who teaches his son Torah, the text attributes it to him as if he himself personally had received Torah at Mount Horeb. As it says, you shall teach your children and your children's children. And then after that it says, the day that you stood. In other words, suddenly everything is turned upside down. According in this Talmudic gloss, this Talmudic way of looking at things. It's not that you yourself saw, even though we like to emphasize often, when it says you saw, the emphasis is that it's very immediate. You really did see. It had impact, it had visual impact for you. And yet the Talmud feels free to say all generations have the capacity to see themselves as if they were there at Sinai, to imagine themselves into the position where they saw things. What's the condition? What will allow them to do that? If they teach it to their children and their grandchildren. That is, you may have got it from your parents, you've heard it from your parents, and you pass it on to your children. And there's something in the act of telling it to your children that will re-visualize it for you. It will bring it up in your imagination. It'll bring it up in not strictly your visual sense, but your inner sense, the inner eye, if we can call it that. Something that you have in fact seen. And I didn't realize I've seen it till I start talking about it to my children. Now that's a certain dynamic, and perhaps especially to my grandchildren. It says ben bincha, and to your grandson. And so Rav Hutner makes a point of saying there's something about the way a grandparent tells the story to the grandchildren that is very immediate, right? It's very personal. In other words, it's the texture of his or her whole life that comes out in the telling of the story. It's a very personal telling of the story, which brings you back to a position at Har Sinai on that day. So it's an as it were, as if, right? This is very far from kind of, fundamentalism that says you were all there and so on. Not that I'm discounting that, but the Talmud is saying something else here. You can be as it were, you can as it were have been there and seen. And there's a certain importance we attach. Well, the sense of sight is an extremely important sense. Among all the senses, one would have to argue very hard that any other sense is more important than sight. I'll put it carefully. Yeah. The sense of sight orients us in space. It gives us a feeling of a reality. If I can see something, then I know that I really exist. People who are blind, lo aleinu, lose some of that sense of my own real existence. And that is the problem. John Berger, who was an English art historian, essayist, novelist, man of many parts, said something that I like about the importance of seeing and of having seen something. I would like to have seen Rome. I would like to have, there are experiences I would like to have had. I would like still to see, because somewhere the idea here is that seeing affirms one's existence on the one hand, but on the other hand, it risks being lost. As soon as you can no longer see something, then you're in danger of losing it, if you take it purely on the physical level. And so what the seeing person who lays all his stock in seeing, in the sense of sight, runs the danger of disappearance, of things disappearing. Disappearing from memory, disappearing from the senses, disappearing from memory. You're living somewhere between this and that. It's a two-faced thing, Berger says. I can quote him. He says, to see and to have seen confirms one's existence, but risks being lost. The visible brings the world to us and also takes the world away from us. As soon as we can't see what we saw before, do we still have it? And do we still have what it did to us anymore? Do we still remember it? And there's a real anxiety about that, the things that your eyes have seen. So the idea somewhere would be to struggle to prevent disappearance. How we do that? By developing an inner eye, he says. And he talks then, uses this wonderful expression, he says, the visible, the experience of things that are visible, produces in us a faith in the invisible. Now, I hope this is somehow understandable. That is, it's highly paradoxical. The visible, the experience of the visible, gives us a real experience, which we hold on to as long as it's there. But when it disappears, the alternative to losing it entirely is developing some kind of faith, that it's just round the corner somewhere. It's invisible, but nevertheless it's still there. If I can hold on to it with my inner eye, then in some sense, I have a kind of faith in the continued life of those who are no longer here. Now, I'm a little jittery about saying this. I'm saying a great deal here. But that's Berger, and Berger is not a man of faith, formally speaking. That's his way of talking about how we look at art. You don't always have to have the work of art in front of you. There's a certain faith that you have. You no longer have it in front of you, and you can't really see it anymore, and yet you hold on to something, what he calls a kind of faith for the continued life of what you've seen. But meantime, what are you to do with things that disappear? What are you to do with the fact that we can no longer see things at Sinai? The Talmud had one solution. Teach your children about it. Teach them about it, and then you will actually see yourselves, right? It's a kind of translation. Ramban. Have a look at Ramban in number 1 on your page. Ramban wants to ask a question about Matan Torah, about the giving of the Torah, and the building of the Mishkan. He says, what's the connection between the two? And the scenario he gives us here is one in which, during the giving of the law, the 10 Commandments, God had given them commandments, and he'd given them a few more commandments in last week's Parsha. And these were kind of headings for the general category of commandments in the Torah. And then, having done what in later generations will be necessary in order to accept a ger, to accept a proselyte. That's how a proselyte finds his place among the people. By fulfilling a few of the commandments, by hearing about Torah, fulfilling a sample few of the commandments, and now he is Jewish. And he says the same thing happened to Bnei Yisrael at Har Sinai, that they had that experience of entering into the situation of commandments, of being commanded, and that changed their status. Suddenly they became Jewish. They became Kedoshim. Something happened to them. They were sanctified. Their status was changed, not so much by the things they saw, but by the things they heard. They heard the commandments, and they fulfilled the commandments, and that's what created them now as a holy people, which is what God wanted from the beginning of the 10 Commandments before, where he says, you will be to me a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. They have now achieved that. And he puts it very flatly, V'harei heim kedoshim. It's very satisfying. Nothing fussy and metaphorical here. Everything is quite clear now. So now they are kedoshim. They are Am Kadosh, because they have declared themselves willing and entered into a covenant with God, into a relationship with God by keeping some of the commandments and being ready to keep others. And so they are fit to have a mikdash in the midst of them. Now, because they're holy, they are worthy of having in the heart of their camp a holy place where God will come and bring his presence. So the Ramban isn't interested in vision at all. He's interested in something a little more abstract. You can call it relationship. The status of the people vis-a-vis God. And in a way, it's a cut and dried situation. Once you've done certain technical things, you have made yourself worthy, and here you are now, and now you can have a mikdash in which God can live among you. And that's on that level that Ramban wants to approach the issue of the connection between the two parshiot, the last week and this week. The connection between God, the covenant. Let's have a look now at number 5. Move to number 3. Yes. Number 5. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tochan. If they make me a holy place, I will dwell in their midst. When was this said? And suddenly, there's a completely different story. The Midrash doesn't go with what Ramban assumes, which is that the holy place, the Mishkan, was commanded at Sinai, when the people were ready for it, when they'd prepared themselves and made themselves Jewish by accepting commandments. Instead, he says, when was this given? When were the laws of the Mishkan given to Moshe? On Yom Kippur, on the very day of Yom Kippur. Why Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is months ahead. From Shavuot to Yom Kippur is several months. In fact, he does some arithmetic. Baal Midrash does some arithmetic. He says it's 3 times 40 days from the day in which they made the golden calf. So suddenly, the idea is that the Mishkan was given, the instructions for the Mishkan were given to the people after they had sinned with the golden calf, way in the future in terms of the text. We're nowhere near that. There's next week's Parsha, and after that there's Kitisa, and then we read about the golden calf. It's all in the future. We haven't not even a whiff of it at the moment. But the traditional view among the rabbis is that is the timing, that the Mishkan may be written right here, straight after the giving of the Torah, but Moshe doesn't report it to the people, and maybe he even wasn't instructed about it until a long time in the future, after there had been sin and forgiveness. In that sense, the Mishkan perhaps would never have been given at all if they had not sinned and been forgiven. Now that's a huge implication of this classic rabbinic way of looking at the chronology of the story. That what happened, right, it's all very well to say, like Ramban, it's all very well to say that they were transformed at Har Sinai, they became holy, and they were fit to have a God dwell among them. But isn't there a little detail that we've forgotten? You know, what's going to happen in very short time? You know, 40, not even 40 days. Yeah? It's not going to take very long. They're going to be very unholy in their way of behaving. They're going to sin big. But the Chazal start at the other end. And they say, no, that is part of the basic reality of the people. We're not going to talk about them being holy to start with. Whatever happened at Har Sinai, let's say it didn't hold. They couldn't hold on to it. They couldn't hold on to what they'd seen. They forgot very quickly. And those are the words that are used later in the story of the golden calf. You know, we're going to constantly now have to be looking with one eye at the golden calf, which is not yet. It's a strange way of reading. It's a very disorienting way of reading. We're going to read about the Mishkan with the understanding that this is really all happening in the future. We have to imagine it now as happening after the golden calf, not before. Not right away at Har Sinai, but afterwards. Let's go on with the Midrash. God said, make me that Mikdash. And then there is the 120 days are counted out till Yom Kippur, when it was atoned. The golden calf was atoned. And then God said, let them make me a holy place, and I'll dwell in their midst, in order that everybody should know that there really has been forgiveness. Okay. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God then said, let the gold in the Mishkan come and atone for the gold with which the golden calf was made. Two things are made of gold. One is the sin, and one is the atonement. The sin is all gold, yeah, Egel has a half, made from the women's golden rings, yeah, of various kinds, melted down, and out comes this calf, Vayetze ha'egel hazeh, right, by some kind of animistic, you know, some kind of strange magic. Out pops the alive and kicking golden calf. But the Mishkan is also made of gold. The significant parts of the Mishkan, which are in the heart of it, betoch, right at the center, in the Holy of Holies, are pure gold, beaten gold. Yeah, the cover of the ark and the Kruvim, the angels. Yeah, it's pure gold in there. One gold, God declares, shall come and atone for the other gold. And that becomes a very famous principle, kind of classic principle. But there is something a little strange about it, because the gold that's associated with the idol, I would have thought that would be sufficient to make gold suspect forever afterwards. You wouldn't want to use gold for anything that approaches holiness after that. No, there's a different way of thinking here. It's a way of thinking, a kind of homeopathic way of thinking. You take what caused the problem, and the gold is understood, as we'll see, to have a lot to do. For instance, well, I'll say it now, Ramban says the gold in the Mishkan represents fire. That is, if you think of it that way, you could more or less see it that way. And if you see gold, there's light, and you can see there's some kind of movement in the gold. But nevertheless, it's very far from fire. It's cold. It's metallic. It's the opposite of fire in so many ways. It's dead, and fire is alive. Yeah. Nevertheless, it's a representation. It's a representation of some kind that in a way should remind you. That is, the Holy of Holies contains in it some reminder of something that went wrong. And the healing for it. The idea that there is something of that principle in itself, the fire principle, can act to heal what was ruined by fire. If you put it like that. And that's in fact how the Midrash ends. The gold will atone for gold and take this offering, gold, and God said, because I will bring a dressing for your wound and I will heal you of your wounds. That is, we're talking here about illness and healing, and we're talking about sin and atonement using the same materials. That is, there's something here that has a kind of irrational quality. Normally we wouldn't go that way. And yet it's a quality that tempts us by its, we know instinctively that there's some truth to this. That sometimes, what are vaccinations made of? That there is such a principle somewhere in real life that sometimes a little of what made you sick can heal you. Right? So perhaps lived through in a different way. Perhaps what we have here now is that when we read the instructions for the Mishkan in this week's Parsha, it's a very disorienting way of reading, to read it, as it were, with an eye to something that has not yet happened. When the Torah says gold, take gold as the first metal, on the one hand it's just gold, on the other hand it is infused with the radiations of something that has not yet happened. You look at gold, you hear the word gold, and you know, oh, golden calf, right? You can't help thinking somewhere, there's an association there. And it's an inappropriate association, but it's actually exactly right. That somewhere there's a complexity about how we think things, how we remember things, how we see things. So that a solid object of gold, very concrete, could become infused with dream imagery. Suddenly it becomes something that has associations of all kinds, that suggest an unconscious world that the people are already living in when the Mishkan is commanded. That is, the Mishkan from the beginning, even if they haven't yet made the golden calf. They're still before the golden calf, right? There's still 40 days to go. Nevertheless, the golden calf is something that is waiting to appear. There is in them something deeply ready for that. And it has to do with fire, it has to do with gold, with a certain kind of desire. And it's already here, even as they're making the holy space, the space. And the holy space now, ahead of time, God is giving it to them as a healing for that. But meantime, they haven't sinned yet. And so they are, in a way, in the most difficult situation. That they don't yet know what in themselves has to be addressed, but it's there in themselves. That is, that we live somewhere in a world, let me put it in psychoanalytic terms, that we live in a world of all kinds of unconscious wishes and fantasies. In a way, a whole bayit. We live in it's a whole world, it's a whole house that we live in, of stories and ways of looking at things and things that express desire for us, things that we want. Right? Freud was very strong on this, desires of all kinds. And as far as we know, it all makes sense. Right? It makes sense, but it's somewhat repressed. We don't really know what it is we desire. So you go for therapy, you go for analysis or whatever, and suddenly what happens is that bit by bit, the analyst helps you recognize your mother language. That is, it helps you recognize what gold is for you, what the associations are with you, what is fire for you. And your own personal history suddenly begins to flame. Suddenly there is an intimate sense of having a live but hidden history, which has created in me a readiness for certain things. If they happen, if the bad things happen, let's say, to be very, very, very childish about it, if we actually go and act out on them, that's not so good. But the point of a therapy or an analysis would be to get familiar with it and to know in some way how to homeopathically heal it, how to be aware of the fires within, and not live in some kind of fool's paradise of thinking that everything's under control. You know, everything's just perfectly in order. So there's a kind of out of order quality about these instructions. They should be perfectly technical, take gold, take silver, right? And instead, because we already know what's going to happen, right? Let's have a look now at number 2 on your page. I hope it'll make it clearer. We'll go back. Number 2. When God said to Moshe, make me a Mishkan, he should simply have stuck 4 pegs in the ground and stretched over them the Mishkan. That is, a tent pegs, a cloth over it. That would have been a satisfactory Mishkan. Why? Why does it begin with this? This is what he should have done. I think the understanding here is that there's something outrageous about God saying, make me somewhere to dwell in the world. Make a nice home for me. Can you just open up a weekend cottage for me in your grounds? You know, I'd really appreciate it. So there's something that's absurd about that. God is going to come and live in my... How can you make a home for God? You know, later, David HaMelech, you know, will say the same thing. Or actually, Shlomo. So what is happening here? So that would have been a minimalistic Mishkan. And sometimes if you're dealing with impossibilities, with huge things like housing God, then at least make it minimalistic, you know, just a purely symbolic structure. But that's not what God wanted. Right? They could have done that and not felt so uncomfortable. But what did he do? What did God do? That he showed Moshe, right, visually, up above, a red fire, a green fire, a black fire, and a white fire. And he said to him, now make this place for me according to the model of what you've been shown on the mountain. Right? That's what you saw on the mountain. Among the things that you saw on the mountain is 4 fires. These are the ingredients. And use those to make a place for me. So Rabbi Brachia that now says, what is this like? It's like a king who had a precious, a very valuable cloak, which was made entirely of precious jewels. And he said to his steward one day, I want you to make me a replica of that. I want you to copy that, this robe of mine. And the steward says, my lord the king, how can I make anything like it? I can't make anything like it because I don't have the ingredients. And then God answers, or the king answers, I remain in my glory and you have your ingredients. In other words, you're not going to compromise my glory by using the ingredients the materials that you have available in the world. I know you don't have fires and you can't build with fire. There is nothing you can do to achieve what fire is in my world, in God's real world. So God here makes a paradoxical promise, and he said, Moshe, so God said, how can I make anything like these? And God says, make it according to the model with blue thread and purple thread and red thread and all kinds of your materials. In other words, a kind of travesty of the original fires, things that are a bit colored, perhaps a bit like the fires, just representations. And then God said to Moshe, if you make what is above below, in other words, you've seen what's above the fires. Now you just make it down here using your materials. Then I will leave my holy court, my court up there, and I will come down and I will shrink my presence in among them down here. Now, the idea of tzimtzum, I will condense, I will fit myself into a small space. But here it's not the space. It's one thing to say that tzimtzum is God fitting into a small space. This is a much more powerful image. It's not a matter of how much space there is for me. That's really childish. But it's a matter of I don't have the materials that you've shown me as what is going on up there that you want down there. So I haven't got, I don't know how to begin to deal with these fires. These fires are living things. And God says, if you use symbolic materials, right? Cold things instead of hot things, static things instead of living things, it's really it's a terrible thing. It's like trying to translate Shakespeare into pidgin English. Yeah. You just decide one day you could do that. You're going to lose everything. You're going to lose the fire of the language and all the associations of the language. And nevertheless, God says there will be an act of tzimtzum here. There will be a strange capacity that you discover for having God live in the midst of you. Right? And those fires won't be entirely incompatible with you. Now, what is above, below? That there's some kind of possibility of God entering into this world if you will aim to house him in some way. If you will use what you have available, which is materials, or let's say also the fires of your nature, the fires of who you are, of your life, to make a space for God inside you. Betocham, that's that other possibility of meaning. And the material now becomes a material that is asking now to be represented by something that's human, that's something that belongs in this world, and it won't repel the divine from coming down and living in it. And so what we have up above for Moshe, the 4 fires, what good are they? How have they helped him? You should make it according to what you have been shown above. That should make it easy for you. I showed it to you. And of course, there's a great irony to that, because in fact, the fact that he's been shown the fires, in a way, makes it harder for him to make a house for God down below. It would have been much simpler if he could just innocently have put a tent over 4 pegs, and that would be all he had. But now that he's seen the fires, he is full of the sense of impossibility. I can't. And that impossibility somehow will lead to something new being created. The sense of the impossible will allow you to use some kind of life force that you have in you, some kind of depth that you have in you, to create somehow, in different terms, a place for God, a house for God. Is that possible? Isn't it possible? Maybe disappointment is built in when you try to take something that belongs to the spiritual sphere and realize it in the real world, bring it down into your materials, into your words, into your body movements, everything that has to do with life in this world, dance and song and story and everything, all our creations, all our ways of trying to contain realities that we've glimpsed up there. At this point, I want to look at the poem that's at the end of your source page. Emily Dickinson. I dwell in possibility. People on Zoom can follow the link in the chat and it should come up. Emily Dickinson. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky, windows of the sky. Of visitors, the fairest, for occupation, this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. The spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. Now, this is a poem about the impossible. Only it's impossible in terms of prose. And she says, I opt for, I dwell in, shachanti. I dwell in possibility. Possibility is making the impossible somehow possible. And what it means is that we're dealing with things that have to do with the largest and the widest, of access to them, conduits to them, through windows, through doors, of chambers that are impregnable of eye, that you can't actually see with your real eye, and for an everlasting roof, a roof that's so lofty and lasts forever. And all these wide, look at these words that have these large, these long syllables, eye, sky, which rhymes with sky, and together paradise. And there you have that sense of the large, the immense, and what do I have in order to? I can't grasp that for sure, but what I can do is with my narrow hands, right, something to gather in, right, and all I have then, and that makes the impossibility clear. This, the spreading wide, my narrow hands. This is it's very, not a long syllable at all. The I there is very short. It means all I have is this, which is really almost nothing. But what it is a spreading wide of my hands. It's a kind of longing. It's a kind of yearning to grasp the impossible. And that is poetry for her. That's what she says is poetry. And I want to think about the Mishkan somewhere with this still ringing in our ears, that the Mishkan is a very real thing. On the other hand, it's an immaterial thing. That it's full, every object has its symbolism. The proportions have their symbolisms, how they are constructed. Moshe has great trouble in putting together the Mishkan. And many Midrashim emphasize it. There's one that I didn't put on your page, but which you might, I think is worth thinking about. When God told him to make the menorah, which is, of course, not only to be made out of fire, it's made of gold, out of fire, but its function is fire. Its function is to raise lights on it. Yeah. Moshe had great difficulty, even though God showed him in his presence how to make it. Re'eh va'aseh, God says to Moshe. Right? It sounds very simple. Just look and do it. Watch me. And God models in front of him. This is how you do it, like you do with a student who's not, not all that quick, to get it. He's a little. So you show him stage by stage. Look, this is what I'm doing. And then the Midrash says magnificently, "Ve'af al piken nitkasha." Nevertheless, he had trouble. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And so God says to him, "What's the trouble? The trouble is the fire." The trouble is that how do you handle fire? How do you manipulate life? How do you make it into something else? And God says to him then, or actually, God engraves it upon his hand. An image of the menorah on his hand. Engraves, that is somewhere deep into the skin. It's a kind of tattoo in his hands. Re'eh va'aseh. Now you're carrying with you a Mishkan that is part of you. It's inside your hand. Right? You'll always be able to consult it like a book, but it's not a book. It's not something outside. It's your own hand. It's your own body. So your own body becomes like a kind of archive. Now you'll always have it accessible to look at. And not only to look at, but clearly if it's on your hand, there is a sensation of feeling it, of constantly feeling the hand, and trying to understand in the way that hands understand, purely in that way, what is the shape of this Mishkan? How should it be? Right? A lot is conveyed, apparently, by that feeling of the hand, which reminds me of what Emmanuel Levinas, the great French Jewish philosopher, says about the caress. And now we are really into the world of the erotic. The caress. He says the thing about a caress, I'll quote him, he says, it's a tender way of remaining in no man's land, between being and not yet being. It grasps nothing, and it issues in no concept. A caress doesn't try to hold on to something. It doesn't grab anything. It doesn't, like you would do with material. It feels its way somewhere. It does it, right? How does he put it here? Issues in no concept. We're not talking about conceptual knowing here. Concept is something you grasp. I mean, you say, I grasp it. Like, it's nothing to do with grasping. It's to do with somehow that movement, of the hand as it seeks for something. It's a certain kind of, it searches, it forages. It's a movement unto the invisible, he says. A movement unto the invisible. And this hand, of course, can then, the hand that has that capacity to feel for things that are not yet there, has the capacity, and here I'm quoting Elias Canetti, talking about the transformed hand. Once upon a time, human beings began to be aware that their hands could make things. Naturally, that their hands could form shapes. They could be natural baskets, open wide. The hand, my narrow hand, and then, so the hand becomes a receptacle. It becomes something that receives and is nourished. And the next stage after that is to make one like it. So you can then make a basket. So the first baskets were made on the model of the hand, using the hand, but not just the hand as instrumental, but the hand as a way of thinking about the possibilities of the world. What might there be in the world that I can't see? How I can imagine the world into something that I can approach. Which reminds me of Rephidim. When Moshe, beginning in Parashat Beshalach, Amalek comes and attacks the people. Do you remember? And the people are in a place called Rephidim, which means of weak hands, feeble hands, Rafu Yedehem. They were already losing what they had seen in Egypt. They were already somewhere in a weak state. And so what does Moshe do? Moshe, he takes the stick in his hand, Mateh Elokim biyadi, he grasps it, God tells him to, and he goes up to the top of the mountain, you remember? And there, according to the Midrash, he drops the stick. He's not holding the stick, but he's spreading his hands in prayer at the top of the mountain. And his arms are up, and the people are looking up at him like that. And when his hands would fall of their natural weight, then they would lose the battle against the Amalekites. But as long as he managed to hold his hands high, like that, in that posture of faith, vehi yadav emunah, his hands were steady faith, right? The kind of steadiness that he achieves, he holds them up against the natural weakness of the body. He holds them up. Then somehow that goes straight to the people's hearts, to their eyes, to their hearts, and they imitate him. That is, somewhere there then is a kind of introduction to a different kind of relationship with God, not just one of instrumentality, that we want to be saved, but the necessity for some kind of relationship between the human being and the invisible God. And there it's done through the hands, through the vision of the hands and through a certain experience of the sensitive hand. The hand, it's a new hand. It's a hand that can create connections. Now, the golden calf emerges from fire, as we said. And it emerges, according to Rashi, according to the Midrash, with a strange life to it. It comes out of the fire prancing and kicking. Right? It's a kind of magical sense of its power. It has firepower. It's not nothing. It's all very well to defend yourself afterwards to God and say, it's an idol. What importance is it? It's just an object. Not true. The idol is alive. It's alive with all the hidden desires. It's alive with basically the fantasies that one represses, and then there comes a moment of breakdown or whatever it is, and suddenly we have a fiery golden calf. And in the heart of the Mishkan also, there are all these objects made of gold, right? That's the cherubs, for instance, the Kruvim, the two angels on either end of the ark, on the kaporet, or the gold cover of the ark. They are made of solid gold. An object of worship in the middle of the Mishkan. That's the obvious, the obvious heretical thought. It's why do we make at the heart of the Mishkan something that recalls, the worship for gold, the worship of fire, however we want to think of that. We're in very dangerous territory. So one of the commentaries, the Chizkuni, points out, and I think it's a very interesting idea, that no one ever saw these cherubs. Only Moshe, one day in the year, Yom Kippur, surrounded by clouds of incense so that he couldn't really see. In other words, this is strictly invisible gold. This is gold fire that is not available to vision. Whatever it is, it's in the imagination as far as human beings are concerned. It's there, but where it really works is in what it looks like, rather than what it looks like. The imagination of what is going on up there at the heart of the mystery. You should make to me a holy place. What is a holy place? A mikdash. And Rashi says it's a beit kedusha lishmi. It's a house of holiness in my honor. But a beit. What is a mikdash? Siftei Chachamim says this. I've always liked this little comment. He says, when you say a holy thing, mikdash, it's an object of some kind. It could be a solid object. But no, it's a thing that has a toch in it. It says, betocham, I will dwell in the midst of them. It has to have a midst. That is, like a house. A house has space, inner space. That's what a house is. A house is not an object. You look at it from the outside and you think, oh, beautiful house. A house, in its inner, intimate sense, is what's going on inside. And that's not things, but verbs. Every room has its function. Every room is there to do something. There's the bedroom, and there's the dining room, and these are places. There's a space that's available for life, which is not an object. There's something else we're talking. We're talking about fire as a living material, and the space and emptiness there that has to be there. There has to be. The Kotzker once said that. We ask the question, where is the place of his glory? Ayeh makom kvodo. Where is the place of God's glory? And his answer, which is really very wide open, is wherever you will allow him in. In other words, wherever there's a space. Don't look out there for it. It's in your inner space, if you can make space, if there's a space available. What is happening there in this cleared space is what happens in all houses, in a sense. What are houses? If one thinks back to one's earliest house, if one thinks one lived, let's say, the house one spent one's childhood in, perhaps the house one was born in, there is a sense somewhere that, as Gaston Bachelard puts it, that space, I'll read it in his words. He says, space in its countless alveoli, I didn't actually look that up, but let's say in its countless cavities, space contains compressed time. Every little nook and cranny in the house is full of memories for me. Many things happened here, beside this bit of this wall, in this cupboard. The house is a big nest, which is full of history. It's full of my past history. It's full of my hidden history of desires, of yearnings, of childhood dreams, reveries. And therefore a house is something, Bachelard says, that should be read. That we should read a house. That a house is something to be understood, not just in terms of its obvious functions, but in terms of its associations, its very personal associations, its intimacy. What it means is it's the place where I was most intimate with myself as a child. And I was constantly escaping into some place to read books, or actually, as he says, reading a book. What is reading a book then? It's actually when you raise your eyes from the book and don't read. You know, those moments of reverie where the book suddenly gets things going in front of you, in your mind, and you look up, and that's when you're really reading. You're reading when you're taking the thing, what it does to you, what it makes you think of. And somewhere that intimate history of a human being, he says, which psychoanalysis tries to analyze, Bachelard says you'd be well advised to focus on a house in thinking of these things, the house that was home, the house that carries all these impressions and memories. And so what we have here then is the need to read the house. Have a look at the Orach Chaim. What goes on in that interior space? Number 6. It doesn't say, I will dwell in its midst, but in their midst. Okay. As if to say that the place which they will sanctify for God to dwell in will be in the midst of the children of Israel. Okay, that's the technical meaning of the Mishkan, of the house. Sheyakifu hamishkan b'daled regalim. That they will surround the Mishkan with their 4 flags. That is the 4 directions of the people, each direction, north, south, east, and west. 3 tribes on each side with all their flags, their insignia. So you have kind of the symbolic representations of the whole people surrounding the Mishkan. That's what we're talking about here, to start with anyway, a kind of internal architecture. But ulai, perhaps, and suddenly there comes this possibility, this poetic possibility. Let's make a poem of it. Dvarim elu heim tshuva. When God asked them to build this space for him, perhaps that was a response to a deep desire that the people had. Not a commandment that came out of the blue and said, this is what I want, a place to live, but rather something that God knows that they want, that human beings want. It's their desire that God is responding to. What is the desire of Israel? And here he refers to a midrash that said that when Bnei Israel were given the Torah at Har Sinai, they saw on the mountain hosts of angels surrounding, with their flags, surrounding God. They saw God at the center of hosts of angels. That was a vision that they had during Matan Torah. Right? They had a kind of supernal vision of what's going on up there, you know, in that out-of-reach world. But they don't want it to be out of reach. In a way, they have a very true instinct. And they say, but we don't want to lose that. And so they want it to be the same in my midst. You know, I want that to be in the middle of us, let's say as a nation, that would be the more concrete meaning, and also in the midst of each individual. That is, that each individual should have that sense of being makif God. It's somewhere holding God at the center. Right? Not having God surround us, which would be a kind of, that's the basic, let's say, childlike wish. That you want to be protected by God, you want the divine surrounds you and holds you. Makif, hakafot. But instead, I will be the environment of God. I will provide the space in which he can be. Now that is a feminine image. It's a maternal image, right? It's an erotic image, just in case you hadn't noticed. And it seems to represent a kind of mature religious wish. Not just the wish for protection, but on the contrary, in some way, the wish to hold at the otherness at the center, to become meaningful by holding something that doesn't quite belong here and yet does belong here. You know, that kind of combination. Something invisible, essentially. Kin b'tochem. That's what they thoroughly desired. Chashku Avivah. And to that desire came God's response from the one who penetrates hearts. Penetrates hearts. From the one who understands unconscious desire. Who understands desire that can't really name itself. And so God said to them, let them make for me a holy place, and I will dwell in the same way as up above in the midst of them. Kamochen, right? In other words, they themselves, starting from the architectural Mishkan, and then moving into the inner space of the human being, there will be a possibility of what they've seen up above. And that desire is capable of being fulfilled. Okay, number 7. Now, so at the beginning of the story, at the beginning of this list of instructions, God says, let them take for me an offering, and then follows all the materials. And now we go directly and vertical flight. Vertical flight straight into poetry. No, we don't stay at all with the technical meaning of that command. Reference to the Song of Songs. What do we find in the Song of Songs? Ani yeshena v'libi er. Ani yeshena v'libi er. I am asleep and my heart is awake. Strange description of the beloved, the woman. She's in her room, and outside is her beloved. The man is outside, and he's knocking at the door, and he's asking to come in. Pitchi li rayati, open up for me, ma. And what is she doing inside then? She's right there in the intimacy of her room, and in the intimacy of herself, her heart. She knows that she's asleep, and so she can't quite get to the door. And in some way, she's out of touch with the world. She's asleep. She's in a stupor of some kind. She's not alive. She's not fully alive. And therefore, she can't respond. At the same time, she says, but my heart is awake. I'm asleep, but something in me is flickering. Yeah. So there's that sense, which you can only get in poetry. Or I don't know if only, actually. Prose, well, of two opposites together. I'm asleep, but I'm actually awake. Something in me knows I'm awake. And that could answer to any number of experiences. You know, sometimes when one is asleep, one dreams, and one knows that one is asleep, but nevertheless there's a dream at the heart of it. There's a sense of intense life. Here, what we have is the kind of divided heart of the woman. She doesn't get to the door till it's too late. And Dodi Chamak Avar, and her lover has slipped away, eluded her, passed, gone on. And Bikashtihu v'lo mitzatihu, I looked for him, I could no longer find him. And that's one of these episodes in the Song of Songs of almost grasping, but not quite. You know, you've almost got it, and then it eludes. What does the Midrash have to say about this? The Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel, said, I am asleep. As far as the end of the story goes, as far as the end of things goes, but God is awake. Now that's a way of interpreting the verse. What is my heart? The essence of me, in some way, is God. A quotation here from Tehillim, Tzur levavi v'chelki, the rock of my heart and my share, my portion in the world, is God forever. So there's some sense that in my heart of hearts, God is there. Even though on the outer layers of my being, I am asleep, I'm forgetting, I'm in a stupor, nothing, I can't be aware of what I need to be aware of. So there's a kind of strange, half-paralyzed sense of things. Or another example, I'm asleep in relation to the commandments. I'm not really fulfilling commandments in the way I should. But the merit of my fathers is standing by me. So somewhere my fathers in me are awake. And somewhere their faithfulness to God in a way saves me from the inside. It's part of me, if I will have it be part of me, if I allow it to be part of me. So there's again that split. There's that split between absence and presence. I'm not really there. I can't get to the door. I'm asleep and yet. And then the final example. And really be Ani Yeshena, I am asleep in making the golden calf. That is, making the golden calf really meant exactly that. It meant it put a kind of stupor on me. And it's a stupor of feeling total satisfaction, dancing around that golden calf, in that circle, as if that gave them all the meaning they could possibly want in their lives. Instead of God at the center, the golden calf at the center. And so I'm in some kind of negative, altered state, but my heart is awake. What is my heart is awake? That's God knocking at the door. Kol dodido fek, yes? My lover is knocking at the door and calling out, please open for me, my sister, my bride, etc. Articulate. And that's what it means. Go back to our original text. That's what it means. When God here commands, let them take for me an offering of all these objects to make a big object in which I can dwell. Oh, how does that work out? And the reading now is, let them take for me, evokes pitchili. Take for me, open up for me, my beloved, my bride. How long will I be standing outside without a house, homeless? The pathos of God standing outside, begging to be let in. How long are you going to leave me wandering around without a home? My hair is full of dew, quoting from the Song of Songs again. I'm getting wet here at night. So it's very poignant and realistic and pathetic. This is the pathos of God trying to find shelter, trying to find that human shelter that could be offered by human desire, if she desired enough. And so God, when he says, make me a holy place, what does he actually mean? So that I shouldn't be outside. Now this is mystical material, not very concrete material. The basic idea is, Midrashic reading, they should let them take for me this offering, is read v'yikhu oti. I'm asking for the offering, but when you buy the when you take the offering and give it to me, I want you to take me. Not just to take the offering, but to take me. You take the buyer. You're buying goods, and if you buy the goods, you're taking the buyer as well inside you. So these are all these objects they should take, but what they really are being asked to take here is God. V'yikhuli, pitchili. So the form li, which means to me, also has the meaning of the direct object. Me, take me inside. Internalize me in some way. Imagine me, I would almost say. But of course, in the imagery of poetry. And so there's a sense of wanting to be both full and empty. That is, on the one hand, she's asleep, and on the other hand, right, here she is, he's begging her to wake up, and she can't quite make it. She can't quite. So here is God living both inside and outside the human being. Right? He's outside trying to get in, and at the same time, she knows that in some way, the memory of him, the thought of him, the desire of him is inside her. And that's the knocking at the door. Martik alai, he's knocking. He's knocking, it's a knuckle knock. It's a hard knock. A knock that, on the one hand, has to do with the idea of fascination. There is this knock at the door, and I don't let him in. Why? Because there's something in me that's fascinated by this unresolved situation. I want to be both empty and full at the same time. I want to have the desire without the crudity, let's say, the too real experience on a solid, eternal basis of God coming and being a permanent resident. How can God be a permanent resident anywhere? If God comes, he will come as flickering fire. He'll come as something that's here and there, it's present and absent. So God is asking to be let in, but the human conditions for this are yes, but. And in a way, allowing time, not just allowing space for him, but allowing time till I let him in, for knowing his otherness, for understanding that he isn't just a nice, comfortable resident inside me, but that he is someone who is impossible to let into me. So that somewhere what we have here is a desire to hold the two of these things in suspension. Not to have a kind of vulgarity about the image of just, I'll let him in and then he'll just move in, right? Vulgarity, or perhaps that's the everyday life, right? It's marriage, you might say. But she wants to prolong the phase of fascination, that there's something other, which I do and don't want to come into residence. And if we take that strange combination into account, we don't, in a sense you might say, the sin of the golden calf was a sin of being too concrete. That is, of wanting God to move in and be in residence. I wanted to have God as just an object in my house. It's very safe, secure, a guarantee, for all kinds of things. And that there's a kind of fetishism about that. We're dealing with fire. We're dealing with God as fire. And what can be the solution for that? You could almost say that God can't be inside unless he's also outside. That's my attempt at a formulation. If the heart can't imagine emptiness, if you become so comfortable that you don't know what absence is anymore, and somewhere God can only be properly inside if we know what we are on the edge of. That there's always the edge of absence. Right? That somewhere we live, that's what we mean by fire. By fire. So Gaston Bachelard says, everything comes alive when contradictions accumulate. When you have, and that's what happens in poetry, of course. And he gives a wonderful example. He says, we feel warm because it is cold out of doors. What makes us feel nice and warm inside? When it's the opposite out of doors. When there's a snowy day, he says, when it's a snowy day and the blanket of winter is covering the ground, and you have heavy drapes going down to the floor in the house, and that's when you feel mukaf, right? You feel surrounded, encompassed, and you feel the intimacy of the inside. You feel the warmth and the intimacy of the inside. And there is that sense of needing to remain in contact with what is the opposite. Right? The opposite to which one can easily just become blasé, where there can be a kind of inertia. That somewhere that sense of remaining on an edge of life, a vital sense, a vibration of life. For Bachelard, this is essential. The cold and the warmth and the strange relations between them. For the Rogashover, on Yom Kippur, when he saw people clopping al-chet, and he saw someone was being particularly manic about it, really trying to get to his heart. And the Rogashover went over to him and he said to him, don't work so hard, there's no one home. Now, it's a kind of cruel thing to say. It means if you are so desperate here. If you are so desperate to, get in touch with your heart, it means that in some way your heart, your subjectivity is not working. You are not, right? You are not really providing the space. In some way, it's a kind of fetishism. You want to resolve any sense of indecision and of things being vague. So you want things to be decided. There's no one home, meaning in order to have someone home, there has to be a yearning. Someone home would be a yearning, would be a desire. If there is nothing of that, and of course we find that in many aspects of life, that eros is the opposite of inertia. Eros is the flickering of desire. It's the constant sense that there's something I want, and I don't have everything. Now, somewhere between the two places, there is a space, and there is perhaps a time, and there is a sense perhaps of a transitional space, where an object can come to symbolize two opposite things. Right? The Mishkan can symbolize both presence and absence. That God is here in the Mishkan, but where is he? He's bein hakruvim. Where is God actually, if you ever were able to see it? If you ever got in there to find out, of course you don't, it's all in imagination. Then where would you find him? Where does Moshe speak to God? V'no'adati lecha sham. God says, you, Moshe, I will meet you there. Where is there? That's in the Kodesh Kodashim, in that most intimate place. And there I will speak to you, v'dibarti itcha sham, mi bein hakruvim, from between the two cherubs. That is, the cherubs have their wings raised up high, prusot lemala, up to their head. They're yearning upwards, and they are turned, each one to the other, but each one also looking down at the Aron with the Torah in it, with the luchot in the Aron. That is, it's a kind of equivocal look. They're not staring at each other, but it's a glance. They're glancing at each other and glancing downwards. There's a kind of shyness about these cherubs. And if you look, I don't know if we have time to read it, but have a quick look at Rabbeinu Bachaya, yes, number 8. These two cherubs are described on one occasion as Shnayim Kruvim and another occasion as Shnei Kruvim. It seems a grammatical, what's the difference between the two? And he maintains that Shnayim you use when you're talking about two who are identical, who are mirror images of each other, Shnayim. And Shnei would be two who are different from each other. And the traditional rabbinic idea, the Midrashic idea, that the cherubs had the form of male and female. And so what you have enacted at the heart of the mystery, right, the inner space, right, what you have enacted there is an erotic situation which describes how much God loves Israel. On Yom Kippur, they would pull aside the parochet, the curtain, and people would have some kind of cloudy vision of the space between the cherubs. That is, the space of yearning, the space of desire, and of intermingled glances. That is, there's some mu'urim ze bazeh. There's like a gaze of intense life from one to the other, and from that place, and down towards the Torah, and from that space between, right, a transitional space between the two who are different, and yet there are two of them. There are two of them, and they're both made of gold. There's something that's similar about them. This represents the love of God and Israel, like the love of male and female, where God and Israel are not the same. They're not the same as each other. In a way, it's impossible to imagine a meeting between them. And yet, their glances in some way declare their desire. And what we have then enacted is the place from which God can speak to Moshe. the middle space, the mid-space from which God can speak. So one has to say this is anything but concrete. Right? This is, it's taking very concrete frameworks. The frame is the images of the Kruvim, which are a skandal, as we say in English. Or in Hebrew, yes. It's a skandal, it's a sha'aruriyah. That's what the Gemara in Yoma says. The Romans conquer the temple and they take this image, this gold block, out into the streets and they mock it. They say, look what they have got at the heart of their mystery, just like us. It's the same thing. It's this gold object which clearly represents an erotic encounter. And what they don't understand, the Bina Machaya says, is that there are two that are, on the one hand, different, and therefore it's impossible for them to meet. And on the other hand, the connection between them is immediate. Bili emtsai. There's nothing between them. And that's the nature of the relationship between man and woman. There is nothing, they don't need any means, any media to get to each other. And certainly the erotic glance. The erotic glance is like that. It's a glance that penetrates. It's a glance that declares the yearning which is desire. And that is God and Israel. That's a kind of image for God and Israel. What does Hamlet say when he's angry at the world? You would pluck out the heart of my mystery. And yet there is much music, excellent voice in this little organ, yet cannot you make it speak. That is, you can't pluck out the heart of this mystery, which is, and everything here is happening around a mystery. Right? What is all this whole story of the Mishkan about? What is it around? What does it surround? A space. A space between two who yearn, which becomes thick with that yearning. And there's no way of plucking it out because we're talking about music. Again, another way of getting away from the concrete is to use the image of music. We're talking about music, we're talking about poetry, we're talking about ways of expressing the inexpressible, possibility, rather than prose. And with this, I want to look with you briefly towards the end of your source page, number 9. Number 9. Now, this is the Torah itself, not a commentary. And Moshe, Moshe would take the tent. What tent? This is something that happened over and over again. He would take the tent and he would pitch it outside the camp, far from the camp. And he called it the tent of assembly. That is, what will ultimately be the tent of assembly, of meeting, of the meeting between God and a human being, God and human beings, has a kind of prior life, a kind of pre-existence in Moshe's own tent. He has a private relationship with God. And where is it situated? Outside the camp. Not in the midst of the camp, but far from the camp. As an expression of God's alienation from the people. This is after the sin of the golden calf. The people, they have not been forgiven yet. And so there's a sense, a demonstrative sense, that Moshe walks backwards and forwards. When God wants to talk to him at that early stage, he goes into his tent, and then there's a cloud over the tent. And let's read on here. When Moshe went out to the tent, the whole people would rise up and stand at the entrance to their own tents, and they would look after Moshe with their eyes. Yes, they would follow him with their eyes until he went into the tent. So their eyes are lingering on him till he disappears. V'haya kevo Moshe ha'ohela, and it would be when he would enter into the tent, that he would come home into the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend, and it would stand there over the entrance to the tent. Just the repetitions, the hypnotic repetitions, the entrance to the tent. And then he would speak with Moshe. One would speak with Moshe. V'ra'a kol ha'am. The whole people saw that cloud, standing at the entrance to the tent, and the whole people would rise up and bow down, each one at the entrance to his own tent. And then God would speak to Moshe inside the tent, panim el panim, with utmost directness and intimacy. As a man talks to his friend, that kind of intimacy, and then Moshe would return to the camp and Yehoshua would stay in the tent, looking after the tent. Now this is the text in the Torah, and it's redolent. All right, it's filled with yearning. We are told very briefly what was going on inside the tent. Right? What should go on in an Ohel Moed, in a tent of meeting. God meets a human being. Right? That's what will happen later too. But this is outside the camp. And we're now seeing this from the people's point of view. V'ra'u ha'am. People would go and stand at the entrances, whenever this happened, and they would watch Moshe in his transit from in among them to his own private tent, where he would have this intimate connection with God. And they would know it by imagination. That is, they can't see it, but they know that's what's happening. When the cloud is over, that's the indication, that's the sign. And there is an internal intimacy happening there. And they bow down, and the come of the whole people rise up, and they bow down at this point. Each one at the entrance to his own tent. That is transitional space, liminal space. What are they thinking when they see Moshe disappearing into an unknown intimacy? And they're, according to the Midrash, they're thinking, Ashrei Adam, happy is the human being who has such confidence that God will follow him into when he comes home. When he goes through his front door, God will, in other words, he doesn't need to look behind him to check. Right? It's not a down-to-earth thing at all. It's an inner sense. It's an inner sense God is coming in with me. It's a desire that should be the case. And Moshe has that. And people are, in a word, when they say happy is the man who, they're full of desire. And even, I would think, a kind of sacred envy. It's a kind of, wow, what that must be like. To have to have God in some sense communing with you, right? In some sense. Now, and they bow down, and they bow down there. What are they doing at this moment? What they're doing, have a look at the next source, and we'll finish with that. Number 10. They bow down, each one at the entrance in the liminal place of his own tent, knowing that theirs is not like Moshe's. When Israel were in the wilderness, they sinned. But then they returned, and they did tshuva. When? How? Beseter. They did a private tshuva. That is, we don't hear any declarations. We don't hear them, crying out for forgiveness. Nothing extroverted. They're just bowing down. What is that? That's an inner movement. It's a movement of the spirit. And they did tshuva secretly, in a hidden way. As it says, the whole passage we've read, the people saw and they bowed down. What does this teach you? That they did tshuva, and they did it in hiding, a kind of intimate tshuva, a tshuva at the core of themselves. The result was, lefichach, nitgalgalu rachamav, God's mercies were stirred, and he gave them Yom Kippur for forgiveness, for them and their children and their children's children, to the end of all generations. So what is God's response to this? He sees, right, it's not a moment of atonement exactly. It's an inner movement of wanting to return to an intimacy with God, of wanting to have God in some real sense with them. And God's reward for that, as it were, is, his recognition of that is that they will have Yom Kippur every day, and it will be out there in the world. It won't be only in their intimate selves, but they've earned the right to it. I like to put it like that. Yom Kippur will not be a formality, just like the Mishkan will not be a concrete, bejeweled house. Right? It will be something that is given warranty. It's underwritten by a movement besetter, an inner movement, an intimate movement. And even as they stand in the Mishkan, and even as they live through the day of Yom Kippur till the end of time, the vista is now to the end of time, the tshuva will still be besetter. They may have gestures, they may clop as much as they like, this, but there is someone at home. God has a kind of trust that there will be someone at home because the people are already in some way signifying that the minimum gesture of bowing down at this moment is a kind of enactment already of something that's going on in that intimacy, which is where God wants to live. Shachanti b'tocham. Thank you.